Chapter 3. The Prime Minister. If any single person today occupies a position of supreme governing power in the British governmental system, it is the Prime Minister. He is usually the leader of the majority party in the House of Commons, the head of the government, the principal advisor to the sovereign. Above all, it is he who chooses all other members of his governmental team, and he may at any time call upon any member to resign, or may move him to a new post, or may reshuffle his government completely, by redistributing the portfolios among his ministers, or cabinet members. In short, the British Prime Minister is one of the strongest elective officers in the world. As a writer on the British Constitution has put it, the government is the master of the country, and he is the master of the government. How does a man reaches this position of supreme authority in the British government? Choosing a Prime Minister. Though an elective officer, yet election alone does not produce a Prime Minister. His choice is a result of many influences and factors. First of all, it should be remembered that in the British system of politics and government, a Prime Minister is not chosen. He chooses himself by his talents, his efforts and achievements during a usually long course of a political career in Parliament, politics, and government of his country. In this long-drawn process, several influences and factors come to play their part in the choice of a Prime Minister. The most important among them are the members of his party in Parliament, and the voters in the country. Has the Queen, or King, any influence in the selection of a Prime Minister? The answer is simple. In the present times, she or he has virtually none, for nowadays he is chosen by his party colleagues in Parliament as their leader. The Labour Party pays no heed to the sovereign's wishes in this matter. The Conservative Party used to pay some deference to royal wishes before 1965, but now it selects its leader in the same manner as the Labour Party. Nevertheless, a ticklish situation remains where the Queen may have some discretion in this matter, as it is a convention that no leader of the majority party can become a Prime Minister, unless and until he is summoned by the Queen to become one. There may be a situation when there may be two equal majority parties in the House of Commons, but such a situation cannot arise, for England has only two-party system, and, therefore, there is always one majority party in the legislature. Moreover, when confronted with a doubtful situation, the Queen exercises her discretion in such a manner as to secure the strongest government available in the existing House of Commons in the shortest time. For this purpose, she consults the leaders of the parties, especially the elder statesmen among them, and acts according to this information about the strength of the two parties in Parliament. But, as we have said above, such a situation never arises in the present times, for the two parties have usually selected a party leader long before the time of the choice of a Prime Minister by the Queen. Before 1965, the two political parties in Parliament, the Labour and the Conservative, followed different procedure in choosing their respective party leaders. Since then, however, they follow virtually an identical procedure. Whenever, for any reason, such as death or resignation or defeat at an election, there is no party leader, a meeting of all the members of Parliament, MPs, of the party concerned, is held to choose a new party leader. Such an occasion arises, on the average, every 9 years in the Conservative Party, and every 10 years in the Labour Party. Then the MPs vote, to choose a new leader from among the two or more candidates. On such an occasion, the votes of the party MPs are determined, inter alia, by two factors: a candidate's position in the party, which is determined by his abilities and past and present achievements in the politics of his party, Parliament, and government of his country, and, secondly, his capacity to add to his party's electoral appeal. The choice is also influenced by the activists outside the House of Commons to some extent. Now, if the party is in power, the choice of its leader is really the choice of a Prime Minister, for the leader of the majority party in the Commons, will necessarily be summoned by the Queen and appointed as the Prime Minister. But if he is the leader of the minority party in the Commons, he becomes the leader of the opposition and is the potential Prime Minister when his party would become the majority party in the House of Commons. As the leader of the opposition, he gets £2,000 a year. Role of the electorate. The second stage in choosing a prime minister lies with the voters in the country at large. Only when a party leader has won an election that he would become a prime minister. It is, however, a very complex affair, for the voters are influenced by many and unpredictable considerations and factors. Nevertheless, some broad considerations which govern their voting behavior may be mentioned here. Firstly, the British people know that the choice of a prime minister is a choice of a government which will rule them for the next 4 or 5 years. Therefore the voters must decide between the two party leaders with a view to decide by what kind of party government they want to be governed. Secondly, the voting behavior of the public, due to the consideration mentioned above, is always determined by class relations and interests, that is, by the class structure in the country. Broadly speaking, the middle class voters generally vote for the Conservative Party leader, while the working class voters for the Labour Party and its leader. But this consideration is, to some extent, negated by the third consideration, mentioned below. Thirdly, in Great Britain, as Dr. Jennings says, there is a close relation between the policies followed by the government and the general ideas of the majority of the electorate. Now this consideration, to some extent, cuts across the consideration of class interests of the voters. In some cases, and on certain occasions, it may be, for example, in the interests of the workers, locally or generally, to vote for the Conservative, rather than for the Labour Party. The reason is that the British voters are more attached to their economic interests rather than to ideological issues, and the leader who has the capacity to produce economic well-being is one more likely to win at the polls. That is why the Conservative Party leaders like Sir Alec Douglas, who won in 1963, the Prime Minister in power, can also influence the voters by his speeches in Parliament and in the public, by his radio talks and television appearance. But if the government of a prime minister is very unpopular, the unappealing leader of the opposition has greater chances of winning the majority votes. Thus Mr. Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister, lost the elections of 1970. In short, the key factor remains the total impression the voters have formed of the party in question that decides the election of a Prime Minister. Office of the Prime Minister. The office of Prime Minister came into being in the days of the first Hanoverian kings when the modern cabinet really evolved. Like the cabinet, the office and the functions of the Prime Minister are also based on conventions of the Constitution. For a long time the very term Prime Minister was disliked by its incumbents. The people hated the idea of a Prime Minister. In course of time, however, they became familiar with his office. The succession of great prime ministers, like Pitt the Young, Sir Robert Peel, Palmerston, Disraeli and Gladstone, enhanced the prestige and powers of the Prime Minister, and made him the most important officer of the King. For a long time the very name of the Prime Minister was known to the laws of the land. In 1905, however, the position of the Prime Minister was officially recognized. But even then he was placed fourth in the official hierarchy. So on official ceremonies, the Prime Minister sits at the fourth place from the monarch, after two archbishops and the Lord Chancellor, who is otherwise his subordinate. Formerly, no salary was paid to the Prime Minister as such. He drew the salary as the incumbent of another office, usually the First Lord of the Treasury or Admiralty. In 1937, however, a law was passed, known as the Ministers of the Crown Act, which provided the salary of £10,000 a year for the Prime Minister, now raised to £20,000. Functions and powers of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister of England is a very busy man. He is responsible for running the whole show. His duties are many. He performs three important roles, namely, leadership of his cabinet, party, and parliament. Leadership of the cabinet. The Prime Minister is the leader of the cabinet, which is the real ruling authority in the country. After his appointment, the Prime Minister selects his cabinet colleagues and distributes portfolios among them. He presides at the cabinet meetings and controls its agenda. He coordinates the work of various ministers and their departments. He has the last word in the making of the policy of the cabinet. If a minister disagrees with him, he has either to accept the Prime Minister's opinion or resign his office. The Prime Minister advises the Queen in appointing and dismissing ministers. He defends every minister who gets into difficulties in Parliament. The ministers seek his advice regarding their own departments. He irons out any difficulty or dispute between two or more ministers or departments. Within his cabinet, the Prime Minister is no doubt the keyman. The outstanding position of the Prime Minister in the government was dramatically illustrated in July 1962, when Mr. Macmillan dismissed 7 cabinet ministers and 9 other ministers, including such stalwarts as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Lord Chancellor, and the Minister for Defence. Leadership of the House of Commons. In the 19th century, the Prime Minister could be a member of the House of Lords. But now he always sits in the House of Commons, and is its leader. Practical, constitutional, and theoretical reasons compel him to sit in the House of Commons. The House has become the more important chamber of Parliament. Indeed, the Prime Minister must lead the House of Commons if he wants to keep his office. All important announcements are made by the Prime Minister on the floor of the House of Commons. He answers questions on critical issues which are always addressed to him. As the leader of the House, he can correct the errors in the statements made by his colleagues. If other ministers fail to satisfy the House, he must explain and satisfy it. Principal advisor of the sovereign. The Prime Minister is the main channel of communication between the cabinet and the Crown. He is the chief advisor of the Queen. He recommends to her the summoning of the Parliament or its dissolution. Party and popular leadership. He is the acknowledged leader of his party, which is, of course, the majority party in Parliament, for it has won the general elections. Indeed, the general elections are fought to decide as to which of the leaders of the two English parties would be acceptable to the majority or the electorate. Thus the leader of the majority party, who becomes the Prime Minister, is also the popular leader of the country. As such, he also guides public opinion by making speeches, holding party conferences, addressing his constituents and the public, and discussing public matters with them. His popularity and importance is very great in public eyes. No one knows, and no one cares, where other ministers dwell, but the fool of fools knows the meaning of no. His powers of appointment. Besides his ministers, the Prime Minister has also the power of recommending the names of persons to the sovereign for appointments to certain high civil, military and church offices, such as the bishops and deans of the Church of England, Lords of Appeal in Ordinary, Lord Chief Justice and Lord Justices of Appeal. He also advises the Crown on appointments of Privy Councillors, which include the ministers, Lord Lieutenants of counties, etc. He also makes similar recommendations for appointments to various public boards and institutions, such as the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, and various boards of nationalised industries and royal and statutory commissions. Lastly, he also makes recommendations to the sovereign for the award of many civil honours and distinctions, and of civil list pensions, and selects the trustees of certain national museums and institutions. Powers of removal or dismissal. The Prime Minister has powers of removal or dismissal of the officers appointed by him. He has the right to ask a minister to resign, or to accept another, usually higher, office. This right arises from the necessary preeminence of the Prime Minister in his cabinet. However, It is very rare that a minister is straight away dismissed by him. It is because there is a tradition that a minister would willingly resign when such a hint is once given to him. Similarly, the Prime Minister may remove such officers of the departments who are appointed with his approval by the ministers, in order to provide for the more effective operation of the government. They are the permanent secretaries, assistant secretaries, other permanent heads, deputy heads, principal financial officers and principal establishment officers of the government departments, usually called the establishment. Other functions. The Prime Minister exercises the general supervision over all departments of the government. Every minister seeks his advice whenever he has any difficulty in his department or with his colleagues. According to Sir Edward Grey, there are two persons with whom a minister ought to be able to toss his thoughts and policy. One is his chief private secretary and the other is the Prime Minister. Prime Minister can decide a departmental affair and get the sanction of the cabinet afterwards. He controls the cabinet secretariat. He is consulted by other ministers regarding matters to be brought before the cabinet. He has also to see that the policy laid down by the cabinet is properly carried out by the various departments. In emergency he also authorizes a department to take an action before the cabinet could meet and sanction it. The position of the Prime Minister. The position and status of the British Prime Minister in the government of his country has always been a subject of much discussion and many comments. Gladstone observed that nowhere in the wide world does so great a substance cast so small a shadow. Nowhere there is a man who has so much powers, with so little to show for it in the way of formal little or prerogative. The British Prime Minister has no statutory duties. He draws his salary, not as a Prime Minister, but as the First Lord of the Treasury. His office was not legally recognized till very recently, and then only indirectly by the Royal Warrant of 1935, and the Ministers of the Crown Act of 1937. The authority of the Prime Minister has no legal basis, in that it is not based on any statute. It all depends on conventions, and on his own personality and his relations with his cabinet colleagues as to how he will exercise his powers and perform his functions. He must also consult his party members, especially his party whips. Position of strength. Although the British Prime Minister's position has always been strong, but it has become stronger still in the present times. At first, he was only the First Minister of the King, and remained for long as Prime Minister pairs the first among the equals. But now he is more than that. Lord Morley, writing in the beginning of this century, wrote that the Prime Minister is the keystone of the cabinet arch. But his position today is much greater. He is, as Sir Ivor Jennings writes, the keystone of the Constitution. We shall now briefly consider the sources of his strength. Leader of the Majority Party. The Prime Minister is the leader of the Majority Party in the House of Commons, and as such he holds a position of great power and authority. Political parties in Great Britain have become highly organized and rigidly controlled by the party leaders and whips in Parliament. They have become the members of Parliament after winning general election in which they had promised the people that their party would do more for them than the other party. The Majority Party wants their leader to be successful. If he does well, and if his policies are successful, his party members, the backbenchers, also share in his success. But if he fails or becomes unpopular due to his policies or methods, they will still support him, at least publicly, though some may grumble privately. It is due to the feelings of party loyalty and party pride. These feelings support a Prime Minister, even when he is at his weakest. In the last analysis, this support is forthcoming, because the party members know well that the defeat of their Prime Minister in Parliament means new elections and loss of seats at the polls. If they go before the voters as a party that has been outvoted in the House of Commons, because some of its members voted against their own government, the chances of such party winning a general election are virtually nil. Hence the party support is always available to a prime minister, for he can hold the threat of dissolution of parliament before any rebellious group in his party, which tries to oppose him, or vote against his policy or measures on the floor of the House of Commons. This is the reason why no prime minister has been forced to resign by a majority of votes against his government in the House of Commons. Thus party loyalty is the main source of the prime minister's strength. But it is not personal in the sense as it is in the countries like Pakistan, where it is partisan. In such countries, once a group has opposed a candidate for leadership of the party, it will continue to do so, even after he has been chosen as the leader, for each group has its own axe to grind, even at the expense of the common interest of the party and of the nation. In British politics, however, while one candidate or the other in a battle over leadership may have his special following, the whole party rallies around a leader once he is chosen. The reason is that loyalty is basically to the principles and ideals the party stands for, not to the person of the leader, i.e., the personal benefits which he would provide to his group of supporters for the partisanship and loyalty shown to him, i.e., his patronage. As we have said above, the Prime Minister has great powers of appointment and removal, and also of granting rewards, honors, and titles. These are his powers of patronage. He can always ensure a majority support in Parliament by means of his powers of appointment and removal, and by distributing the gifts and rewards among his party members, who are eager to be appointed to 100 or more posts, or to the ministerial positions, all of which are within the powers or patronage of the Prime Minister. A Conservative Prime Minister also confers peerages and knighthoods on his supporters, i.e., party whips. The Prime Minister has several party whips, the government whips, headed by the Chief Whip, at his beck and call. They keep the Prime Minister informed of the opinions of his party members in Parliament, and to rally them to the support of the Prime Minister when he is under attack on the floor of the House. For this purpose, the whips have many minor gifts to win their support, such as places on the committees, membership of the Council of Europe or the European Assembly, or inclusion in the government-sponsored delegations abroad. Leadership of the Cabinet. The Prime Minister is chairman of the cabinet and coordinator of policy. This is the most important factor in strengthening his position. In this respect, his position, though always strong, has become stronger during the present century. It would, indeed, be far too modest to say that he is the first among equals, because he is now more than that. As Sir Anthony Eden, himself a former Prime Minister, has put it, a Prime Minister is still nominally primus inter pares, but in fact his authority is stronger than that. The right to choose his colleagues, to ask for a dissolution of Parliament, and, if he is a Conservative, to appoint the chairman of the party organisation, add up to a formidable total of power. Lord Butler commented, "I think that on the whole the Prime Minister has tended to stop being an equal among equals. There is a tendency not exactly to dictatorship, but to be the leader who does control everything, and things are getting more and more into his own hands." In fact, recent writers on British Constitution, like Sir Ivor Jennings, have emphasized that the Prime Minister has become so predominant among his ministers and cabinet colleagues, that his position can be described, not as that of a moon among the stars, but of a sun around which planets revolve. In order to understand the reason for the predominant position of the Prime Minister, we must keep in mind the hierarchical organization of the ministry or cabinet. First of all, the cabinet is the Prime Minister's cabinet. The government is his government. Every cabinet minister is in a sense the Prime Minister's agent, his assistant. If he disagrees with the Prime Minister, he must argue it out in the cabinet meeting, or accept the latter's opinion or resign. Indeed, as Sir William Harcourt said, The most successful administrations are those in which there is a strong prime minister and a subordinate cabinet. The cabinet is formed by him, changed and reshuffled by him. The cabinet discusses the things which the prime minister wants it to discuss. He prepares its agenda. No minister can take a move in his department without first consulting the prime minister. Nothing of great importance is decided, or even planned in any department without his personal cognizance. Any important or weighty business would commonly go to him, before being submitted to the cabinet. The cabinet is, writes Ramsay Moo, the steering wheel of the ship of state. But the steersman is the prime minister. The prime minister can decide when, and what the cabinet will consider, and he can always propose that a matter should go to an ad hoc committee of ministers whom he can nominate. Moreover, he need not put a matter before the cabinet, but need only consult 2 or 3 senior cabinet ministers, the inner cabinet, and then put the matter before the cabinet for its acceptance. Thus, were decided many important matters, which led to great national and international events, still as the invasion of Egypt in 1956 over the Suez dispute with President Nasser, which, however, ended in dismal failure, because Great Britain was no longer a great power as she once was, the devaluation of the pound sterling in 1967. Or the military withdrawal from east of Suez in 1970. V. Control of the civil service. Another source of strength of the Prime Minister is the fact that the whole apparatus of government is at his command, from the senior ministers at the top down to the permanent civil servants in all the government departments. It has become such an important source of strength that a new department, the Civil Service Department, has been created which works closely under the direction of the Prime Minister. V. Influence over the mass media. The Prime Minister is always a close student of public opinion and an expert in propaganda. He must know what to say, when to say it, and when not to say anything. He has, in fact, innumerable opportunities to influence public opinion by means of his speeches in Parliament and outside, by press releases, radio talks and television coverage. The British press as well as the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, which includes the British television, are fed with the Prime Minister's interpretation of government policy and present him as the national leader. The fact that he can, to a large extent, choose when and how to act, gives him a constant advantage over the leader of the opposition who has usually to content himself with reacting. Only when a Prime Minister has become unpopular, that the leader of the opposition can expect better coverage of his views in the newspapers and other mass media. VI. Right to choose the date of election. Lastly, the Prime Minister is the only person in the British government who decides when to hold a general election, that is, to dissolve Parliament and go to the polls. The responsibility for a defeat at the polls is also his. The timing of the election is, however, so contrived as to give a better chance of winning it. Limitations on the powers of the Prime Minister. In spite of his immense powers, the British Prime Minister is not an autocratic dictator. Gladstone, a late 19th century Prime Minister, said, "The head of the British government is not a Grand Vizier. British Constitution has placed no limits on his powers, except that he must enjoy the confidence and support of the majority party in the House of Commons, which, in its turn, it must have won in a general election. Nevertheless, the powers of a Prime Minister depend on his personality, the character of his cabinet colleagues, and on the conditions of his country, or the conditions of the time. We begin with the last mentioned factor. The conditions of the United Kingdom, as a country, are rapidly changing in the modern times, both internally and externally, at home and abroad. The duties of the government have increased tremendously. Those tasks and functions which were performed only by the exceptionally strong prime ministers in the 19th century are now part and parcel of the duties of then the most ordinary premier today. In the last century, a prime minister had time enough to supervise personally the work of every department, and could himself be its senior minister. Not so a modern prime minister, even if he wanted to be one. Nature of his work. The British prime minister is indeed the most hard-worked man. He is always pressed for time. He has to go through numberless papers and endless correspondence. He has to attend to visitors. He confers with individual ministers. He goes to the Buckingham Palace to report to and consult the Queen. He presides at the cabinet meetings and spends much time in parliamentary debates, ever ready to answer questions. He decides the questions of technical procedure put to him by his colleagues. He has to attend ceremonies and other social meetings. He is sometimes taken to public galleries or the like. Lastly, though not in the least, he has to visit his constituency. These duties can be adequately performed by a man possessing a distinguished personality. Now all this could possibly be done by a prime minister in the past. For example, Sir Robert Peel did so in first half of the 19th century and Disraeli and Gladstone did in the second half of that century. But no modern prime minister has the control over the whole government process. The extent of modern government is such that no prime minister can be expected to grasp all the intricacies of his minister's work. Even the development of the cabinet secretariat as a body of officials, largely to assist the prime minister, cannot enable him to dominate his colleagues and control their work as the 19th century prime ministers did. The work and activities of a modern prime minister are to a certain extent bound to be limited and specialized, so that he inevitably relies upon the opinion of such of their colleagues as are specialists in their fields, as for example, Churchill, no economist himself, trusted his Chancellor of his Exchequer in financial matters. This is particularly so when a prime minister is not of exceptional caliber or influence vis-a-vis his colleagues who, therefore, tend to constitute the inner or super cabinet around the prime minister. The character of his cabinet. The second limitation on his power comes from the character of the colleagues he chooses and the kind of the cabinet he forms, both of which are variable factors. Broadly speaking, the British government is organized as a pyramid of power, with the Prime Minister at its apex, and a hierarchy of authority below him. As Professor Chester writes, there is a kind of hierarchy of ministers, the Prime Minister and his three senior colleagues, Lord President of the Council, Foreign Secretary and Chancellor of the Exchequer take general responsibility for one or other of the main fields of government activity. The other ministers who are in the cabinet, and who therefore partake of collective responsibility as well as each being responsible to Parliament for his own department, and the ministerial heads who are excluded and who are brought only into such cabinet discussions as are of particular relevance. Now much of the departmental work is done by the minister, concerned within his sphere of responsibility, or in the cabinet committees without referring it to cabinet as a whole, then providing much time to the prime minister and his senior colleagues for the work of formulation and coordination of the government policies. This is, however, only the institutional framework of the cabinet system. Much depends on how a prime minister organizes it in his day-to-day relations with his colleagues. Here no constitutional formula or framework is of much assistance to him. What helps him most is his success as a leader of his party in Parliament and in the cabinet. And it is here that his personal qualities, his personality, come into play and determine his success as a prime minister. As Lord Asquith said, the office of the prime minister is what its holder chooses to make it. That is on his character. When a new prime minister comes into office, after winning a general election, his position is generally strong, and he likes to include in his cabinet as many of the leading members of his party in Parliament as possible, even though they were his opponents at the time of his selection as the leader of the party. Afterwards, if his government is a success, and he is assured of party loyalty, he can reshuffle his cabinet, dropping or relegating to unimportant departments those who persistently criticize or oppose his policy. Thus Mr. Wilson in 1968 accepted the resignation of Mr. George Brown, his defense secretary, with which he had often threatened the Prime Minister. So with every success, the Prime Minister has greater scope and freedom to elect and promote his colleagues as he likes. Thus a successful Prime Minister is a strong Prime Minister, though he may not be a great Prime Minister. Prime Minister's personality, a decisive factor, but no cult of personality. So a successful Prime Minister is a strong Prime Minister, but not necessarily a great Prime Minister. These differences are, inter alia, due to his personality. More often than not, a British Prime Minister would be successful Prime Minister. The reason lies in the selective system of the British Constitution. Every young man, and now a young woman, since Mrs. Thatcher has become the leader of the Conservative Party, who comes to Parliament as its member, and has the ambition to be a Prime Minister in the future, has to go through a long process of political apprenticeship, as an active member of the House of Commons, as a junior minister, when his party is in power, and then as a senior minister. If he has proved his worth in his previous roles, and then a leader of his party in Parliament, after contesting for it with two or more equally ambitious and influential rivals, and finally he has to fight a general election to become a Prime Minister, it has been calculated that, on the average, it takes a man 24 years in Parliament to be selected as the leader of his party, and 26 years to become a Prime Minister. Given this long period of preparation, a man must possess distinctive qualities of personality, capacity for hard work, leadership, and alterness of mind, and to be a good judge of others, to become a successful Prime Minister. In short, he must be a good speaker, a great debater, an expert organizer, a tactful coordinator of tile work and responsibilities of his subordinates, and a good propagandist and strategist, to win the public support in a general election. Personal qualities of the Prime Minister. The whole structure point of the British government is like a pyramid, with the Prime Minister at its apex. His office makes a Prime Minister, but his qualities make him greater still. His office demands from him the supreme qualities of an alert organizer, and not be a drifter. He should possess, as Finer says, wide-ranging knowledgeability, not over-specialization or ignorance. No doubt, the qualities vary from one Prime Minister to another, yet he must be a good organizer, a great debater, or at least a good impresser, and, especially in the present times of mass democracy, he must be one who can in one or another way win the support of the masses. He is always on trial, closely watched by his cabinet colleagues, his party members, by the opposition in Parliament, and by the leaders of the public, as he, in his turn, closely watches them all, especially in the House of Commons. Criticism is, therefore, candid and constant. Hence the qualities of the Prime Minister are constantly tested. His position and value constantly vary with his day-to-day achievements. While it is generally agreed that the Prime Minister's powers are today great, and in many respects are growing, his position and importance in the governmental structure is still much debated both by the practicing politicians and academic writers. Some assert that there has occurred a basic change in the system of cabinet government. Mr. Crossman, for instance, argues that the post-war epoch has seen the final transformation of cabinet government into prime ministerial government, and J.P. Mackintosh claims that now the country is governed by a prime minister, his colleagues, junior ministers and civil servants, with the cabinet acting as a clearinghouse and court of appeal. On the other hand, some politicians and academic writers still believe that the Prime Minister is no doubt a powerful, but not an overwhelmingly supreme figure, inasmuch as the cabinet still remains an effective body, whom a Prime Minister cannot and ought not to give directions or decisions. In spite of this controversy, the fact is that the position of the Prime Minister depends to a great extent on his personality. A Prime Minister like Churchill would exercise much greater authority and influence than one like Attlee over his cabinet. But this does not mean that he is as powerful as the chief executive in the so-called presidential cabinet of the USA. Paradoxical though it may seem, the British Prime Minister's power is greater than the authority of the President in the American system of government, due to the unitary nature of the British Constitution and the absence of the principle of separation of powers in it. The pyramidal structure of the British cabinet system necessarily makes the power and authority of the British Prime Minister very great. But more than this is required to be a great Prime Minister. To be so, he must rise above party leadership and become a national leader by inspiring it with new ideas and visions of national greatness. Much depends on the personality of the man himself, the support that he enjoys in his cabinet, the personalities of the other members of the cabinet, the strength of his party in the House of Commons in the country, and the international conditions of the time. Perhaps the days of the great prime ministers of Great Britain are over. England is no longer the superpower as she was during the 19th century, or the great power as she was during the two world wars, when she possessed a great empire. This is the lesson which the British leaders have learned since the end of the Second World War, especially during the Suez War of 1956, which Sir Anthony Eden launched against Nasser's Egypt, but had to call off hurriedly when threatened by Russia, one of the two superpowers of today. This is also the reason why the British leaders, who were so opposed to this idea before, have sought the membership of the Common Market or the European Economic Community, in which she is only an equal partner with West Germany, France or even Italy, not to speak of the lesser ones. Indeed, gone are the days when a British writer could write, as Sir Ivor Jennings wrote, that happy is a country that can call out its Palmerstons, its Lloyd Georges and its Churchills in time of war, for England cannot fight a war, great or small, single-handedly and build an empire of her own, or even hold one, as the events in Rhodesia and South Africa are showing today. In the end, however, one good thing can be said of the British political leadership: there is no cult of personality, even of a great prime minister. When the Second World War was over in 1945, Mr. Winston Churchill, who had proved himself a great prime minister in wartime, was voted out of office by the ordinary men and women in the general election. Although from every poster on the walls and billboards, the pictures of Churchill were calling upon them to vote for Churchill or chaos. The British voters cannot be bamboozled by a personality cult. The reason lies in the factor we have analyzed above, that is, the loyalty to political or party leadership is not personal but ideological and national. A voter or a party member is loyal, not to the person of a leader, however great, but to the principles he stands for. Comparisons with other heads of governments, comparisons between unlike systems, are always inherently misleading. But they are useful for a student of comparative constitutions. From our brief survey of the powers and position of the Prime Minister in the governmental system of England, it is safe to say that he possesses greater power than the President of the United States. Although the US Constitution has granted executive powers to the President, especially the power to conduct war, he does not enjoy those sources of strength that are available to the British Prime Minister, when backed by loyal majority in Parliament and effective cabinet, both of which are under his control, and of his own making, as we have shown above.